The platform was crowded by 6 in the morning. Children in rows, tagged, each one wearing a paper label pinned to their coat with a number that corresponded to a ledger entry at the Children's Aid Society office on Nassau Street in New York. The label was not a name. It was a reference, a way of matching a child to a file in case of administrative confusion during the journey west. The trains ran from 1854 to 1929, 75 years. Somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 children. The historical estimate varies because the records were not consistently kept, were transported from the cities of the Eastern Seaboard to rural communities in the Midwest, the South, and the Great Plains. The program was called by its founders a system of emigration. The children were called, by the newspapers that covered the arrivals, orphan train riders. Most of them were not orphans. This is the first thing the archive clarifies. The Children's Aid Society and the other organizations that ran placing out programs received children from a variety of circumstances. Some had lost both parents. Many had lost one. A significant portion had living parents who had surrendered them under economic pressure so severe that keeping a child was not a viable option. Others had been removed from families by court order on grounds that the legal record describes with varying specificity. Charles Loring Brace, who founded the Children's Aid Society in 1853, was not secretive about his theory. His published writings describe the urban poor as a dangerous class, children of immigrants, children of the streets, whose reformation required removal from the environment that had produced them. The placing out program was not merely charitable. It was, in Brace's own documented language, an instrument of social transformation. The trains carried children whose families were not gone. They carried children whose families were poor. Here is what the placement contract actually said. The agreement signed by receiving families, the farmers, the tradespeople, the rural households who took children from the orphan trains, were not adoption documents. This distinction is not semantic. Adoption, as a legal process, transferred parental rights permanently and created a new legal relationship between child and family. The placing out contract did something different. It created a labor and custody arrangement that was explicitly temporary in most cases, revocable by the placing organization, and structured around the child's usefulness to the receiving household rather than the child's welfare within it. The standard Children's Aid Society agreement required the receiving family to provide the child with food, clothing, schooling, and church attendance. It required the family to treat the child as a member of the household. What it did not require, what it explicitly did not guarantee, was permanence. The society retained the right to remove a child from a placement at any time. The receiving family retained the right to return a child at any time. Children could be, and were, returned. The society's own records, which historians have analyzed in detail, document a category of placement outcome described administratively as unsatisfactory. A child returned to the society could be placed again with a different family, in a different state, under a different number in the ledger. The paper trail connecting a returned child to their original family, their birth family, their siblings, the parents who may have surrendered them under duress, was not a priority of the administrative system. It was, in many documented cases, severed entirely. And here is where the bridge of relevance matters. Because the experience of being moved through an institutional system that processes you as a placement rather than a person is not a condition that ended in 1929 when the last orphan train ran. The administrative logic that produced the placing out contract, the logic that a child's connection to their family of origin is secondary to their utility in a new household, is recognizable in foster care systems, in adoption practices, in child welfare bureaucracies that still operate today under the assumption that institutional placement is an improvement on documented poverty. The orphan train riders were not the last children to be moved through a system designed primarily for the convenience of the system. The receiving family's side of the record is instructive in a specific way. The Children's Aid Society published annual reports throughout the program's operation. These reports included statistics on placements, follow-up visits, and outcomes. What they did not include, what historians note is conspicuously absent from the published record, is systematic data on what happened to children after placement. The Society conducted follow-up visits in some cases. In many cases, particularly for placements in distant states, follow-up was not conducted at all. The child left the train platform, entered a rural household, and disappeared from the Society's active records. The follow-up visits that were conducted generated reports. Those reports exist, in fragmentary form, in the archives of the Children's Aid Society and related organizations. What they show is a range of outcomes that the Society's published annual reports do not fully capture. Children thriving in genuine family environments. Children working as farm labor with no school attendance despite the contract requirement. Children who had been renamed by their receiving families, given new first names, sometimes new last names, with no documentation of the change and no notification to the placing organization. If someone in your life is descended from an orphan train rider or has hit a wall, tracing a child who appears in an eastern city in the 1870s or 1880s and then vanishes from the record entirely, send this to them. The placement ledgers are partially digitized, and the trail is more recoverable than most families know. The renaming practice is where the administrative record becomes most revealing. A child who arrived at a train platform as Patrick Donahue, a name recorded in the Society's ledger, matching a family record in New York, might be absorbed into a receiving household as Thomas Miller. The new name would appear in the local census, in the school register, in the church baptismal record if the receiving family had the child re-baptized. The old name would remain in the Society's ledger in New York, attached to a placement record that noted the receiving family's address, but not the name change. The two records, the New York ledger entry and the rural census entry, would not find each other without a deliberate act of archival reconstruction that the Society's administrative system was not designed to facilitate. The child existed in two paper identities simultaneously and belonged, in the administrative sense, to neither. The Society's ledgers are where the record stops being abstract. The Children's Aid Society maintained placement books, bound registers, organized by year, recording the name of each child sent west, the train they traveled on, the state they were placed in, and the name of the receiving family. These ledgers were destroyed. They were transferred, over the course of the 20th century, to the archives of various successor organizations and eventually to university collections. The core records are held today at the University of Minnesota's Social Welfare History Archives. They are not complete. The gaps in the ledger record are not random. Historians who have worked with the original volumes note that the record-keeping quality varies significantly by period and by the organization running the placement. The earliest years of the program, the 1850s and 1860s, are the least documented. The period of highest volume, the 1880s and 1890s, is better documented but still marked by inconsistencies. Children recorded by first name only, receiving families listed without street addresses, placement states noted without counties, For a child placed in Kansas in 1887 under a first name and a receiving family surname, the trail frequently ends there, not because the child disappeared, because the system that moved them was not built to be followed. And then there is the question of the Catholic children. The Children's Aid Society was a Protestant organization. Charles Loring Brace was explicit about the reforming role of Protestant rural households in the moral development of urban immigrant children, many of whom were Catholic, Jewish, or Orthodox. The Catholic Church recognized this explicitly and objected to it formally. Archbishop John Hughes of New York condemned the placing out program in the 1850s as a mechanism for the forced Protestantization of Catholic children. His objection is in the historical record. It is not a later interpretation. The Catholic response was to establish parallel placing out organizations, most significantly, the New York Foundling Hospital, run by the Sisters of Charity, which ran its own train program placing Catholic children with Catholic families. The Foundling Hospital's records are separate from the Children's Aid Society's records and are held at the New York Archdiocesan Archives. What both sets of records share is the same administrative gap. A child leaves a city institution, travels west, enters a rural household, and the follow-up documentation is thinner than the placement documentation. The system was better at moving children than at tracking them. The follow-up visit reports that do survive contain the detail that the published annual reports omit. And what they contain is this: children working full agricultural days with no school attendance in direct violation of the placement contract. Children sleeping in outbuildings rather than in the household. Children who, when the visiting agent arrived, could not immediately recall their birth surname, not because they had forgotten it, but because the receiving family had not used it, had not allowed it to be used in the years since placement. The visiting agent's report would note the irregularity, would recommend a follow-up visit, would file the report in the Society's administrative system. The follow-up visit, in a significant number of documented cases, was not conducted. The Society's published record describes the Orphan Train program as one of the great philanthropic achievements of the 19th century. The private record, the follow-up reports, the returned child files, the correspondence between placing agents and receiving families, describe something more complicated, a system that worked well for children placed in genuinely caring households, a system that worked badly for children who were not, and that had no reliable mechanism for distinguishing between the two in advance, and no consistent mechanism for intervention after the fact. The contract said nothing about return. And for the children who needed to return, the silence of that contract was not an administrative oversight. It was the architecture of the system. If this is landing differently than you expected, subscribe. The next investigation follows a different institutional record, one where the children never left the city, and what happened to them inside the institution is what the archive refuses to say. What the orphan train record shows, when the placement ledgers and the follow-up reports and the returned child files are assembled together, is a program that was genuinely beneficial for a portion of the children it moved, and genuinely harmful for another portion, and that the organization running it had limited ability to predict which outcome a given child would experience and limited willingness to document the harmful outcomes in its public-facing reports. The annual reports counted placements. They did not count returns. They counted children placed in satisfactory homes. They did not count children who were not in satisfactory homes but whose placement had not been officially reviewed. The number 200,000 is the number of children placed. the number of children for whom placement was a genuine improvement in life circumstances. The archive does not contain that number. The Orphan Train program ended in 1929. It ended not because the society concluded that placing out was harmful. It ended because the child welfare reform movement had spent 3 decades building an alternative framework, one that prioritized keeping families together over removing children from them, that required licensed oversight of placements, that established the legal infrastructure of what would eventually become the modern foster care and adoption systems. The reformers who ended the orphan trains believed they were building something better. What the archive shows about what came next is not entirely reassuring. The foster care system that replaced placing out inherited several of the same structural problems. Children moved through administrative systems that processed them as cases. Follow-up inconsistent, documentation incomplete. The connection between a child and their family of origin treated as secondary to the administrative goal of placement. The contracts, more formal now, legally binding, subject to court oversight, still did not guarantee permanence. Children could still be moved. Families could still be separated. The paper trail connecting a child to their origins could still be severed, in practice, by the accumulation of administrative decisions that no single official was responsible for reviewing as a whole. The orphan train riders who survived into old age and gave interviews to historians in the 1970s and 1980s, a body of oral history that is itself now archived, described with remarkable consistency a specific experience. The moment on the platform when the train pulled away, and the understanding, sudden and total, that the world they had come from was not coming back, not because their families were dead, because the system that had moved them was not designed to move them back. The contract said nothing about return. And the children who stood on those platforms, wearing paper numbers instead of names, understood, before the adults did, what that silence meant.